We're going to talk a little bit in this video about database diagrams. So we're going to go back and look at some of the things that we did when we did entity relationship diagramming in those early days of school. And often we'd come up with this, and this is our classic example of relationships, and that's employee to department. And we said there's a relationship between employees to departments, and there's also a relationship from departments to employees. Okay? And we define that relationship basically with the little relationship line here. This has a crow's foot on the employee side and a single toe on the department side. So we would read this as each employee must have one and only one department, or must be a member of one and only one department. Each department may have one or more employees. Okay. At some point, this logical diagram has to become reality, which means we have to convert each one of these entities into a table. So the employee entity becomes the table. Its different attributes become the columns in the table. The department becomes its own table. Each of its attributes become columns in that table. But what about the relationship? How does that get defined? So what we end up doing is normally on the many side, we stick in another column on the table. And in this case, that column would have department ID in it for the employee. And that department ID for each employee would point to the primary key department ID of the department table. Okay? And when we build these tables in our database, we can actually use a tool that's built into SQL Server Management Studio to visualize these relationships, how they're built in the physical database. So this is the conceptual model or the logical model. Ultimately, we have to create a physical model that defines how we're going to define our tables and what each data type is going to be for each one of these attributes. So we go through that process, but we can actually get these diagrams, the final physical diagram for our database, out of SQL Server Management Studio. So that's what we're going to look at first today. So if I come over to SQL Server Management Studio and I come to my sample database, you can see there's a folder that says database diagrams. All right. So we're going to go through this and we're going to look. I'm going to get a query window up here so I can give me a place to paste some things. But I'm going to go back here to my database diagrams, and when I click on it, I can say new database diagram. And the first thing that happens is I get an error. Okay. It says this database does not have one or more of the support objects required to use database diagramming. Do you want to create them? Now, before I do that, you may get another error that happens before this one. I don't have that error on this system. So before I go ahead and say, yes, I want to create them, I want to show you how to fix the error you might get. So the first error you might get is going to say something like this. Cannot execute as the database principal because the principal database owner object does not exist. This type of principal cannot be impersonated, or you do not have permission. Okay, and that's kind of a cryptic statement, but if you spent the time on Google, you could probably find the solution yourself. Okay, and that is, let's go to the sample database, right click and say properties. Okay, so once we're into the database properties, click down on files, and if you got that error, it's probably because you do not have anything set right here in the owner for your database. So maybe you do, maybe you don't. If you didn't and you got that error, you need to come in here to the owner. It'll be blank. Click on the ellipsis and you're going to go browse for your name. Okay, there, that's me on this computer, M. Geiger. So I say OK and OK, and now it has me set as the owner of this database, which gives me permission to do some things, okay, like create the things I need for the sample database. So you could get that. If so, come in, select the owner just like I showed you. Okay. Then when you go to database diagrams and you say new database diagram, you'll get this second error. You probably will get this no matter what the first time you try to do a diagram. The database does not have one or more support objects required to use database diagramming. Do you wish to create them? Well, yeah. If I want to, it always gets me that it asks us that, because if I said I want a new database diagram, of course I probably want the tools. So I'm going to say yes. Okay. And it comes up and it shows me the tables that are in this database. So in our sample database, we have countries, departments, employees, and they're all listed here. What ones do we want to add to our diagram? For this one, because this is a small database, I'm going to add all of them so we can see the full diagram of what's going on with our tables in this database. If I wanted to, I could just do departments and employees so that I could compare it to that ERD that I showed you a second ago. But I think we can still do that even with all these other tables in here. So we're going to add all of them. I'm going to click add. And it's going to throw them in this for me. You can see it all populate, and here they are. And as soon as it's done, it kind of lays them out. And let's see if we can zoom out just a little bit. I'm going to go out to 75% there. And we can kind of see them all. And notice here's our employees, and it shows us relationship lines between employees and departments. Okay. But we also see there's actually two relationship lines between employee and departments. Now, we have some fields in here that we didn't have on our simplified ERD over here. Like each department has a manager, and that manager is in the employee department. That creates a second relationship from department to the employee who is the manager. So we'll look at that. We'll look at these here. But notice the notation is different. There's lots of ways to do database diagrams. There's different notations for your ERDs, for your logical models, like we did back here. You'll see slightly different notations depending on the 3 or 4 different systems we used. The fact that you know one of them means you'll probably be able to figure out the rest of them. So let's go look at the system we're using here. What can we tell about it? On one side, let's look at this. Let me zoom in. I'm just going to zoom in employees and departments. I'm going to go up to 150%. And we'll just look at, I think instead of trying to do this, I'll use the sliders. Employee to departments. Okay. I see this relationship line, and it's got an infinite symbol down there, and you can almost guess what that means, right? That means there can be more than one employee in this department. Okay. And the key means there is a key in the employees table that points to departments. Let's see if we can right click on that and say properties. Let's take, oh, excuse me, this is the manager. I set it backwards. Okay, let's look at the other one first, because that's the one, this is the one that we're diagramming here. It's this relationship, employees to their departments. I'll show you the manager one in a second. So let's look at this one, and we can see the properties over here. It actually has a name, employee department foreign key. And the foreign key base table is the employees table. The department ID in the employees table, which is right there. Go back to the relationship. I keep clicking off of it. Good. Points to the department's department ID. So this is a foreign key in the employees table, department ID, and whatever each employee has matches an entry for the department ID in the departments table. And that's what creates our relationship. The foreign key points to the primary key of the other table. Okay. When it comes to the manager ID, this manager ID for each department points back through this relationship to one of the employee IDs. Okay. So an employee can be in a department, but an employee can also be the manager of a department. So there's really two relationships here. We didn't talk about the manager aspect a lot of the times in our simplified models. But this one definitely has it. Let me zoom back out to 75% so we can see everything. Okay. Each department has a relationship to its location, and we can click on the relationship line, and we can come over here and look. The department's location ID points to the location ID of the locations table. We can see that right here. And actually we can click on the ellipsis if we want and look at it here. The locations table, its location ID. The foreign key table is the departments. That has a location ID that points back to this primary key of that table. So these are all set up for us. Okay. When we built our tables, we created these, and we'll learn how to create the statements that actually create the foreign keys and their relationships to the other tables. We'll learn how to do that later on. But right now we're going to deal with how do we get data out of more than one table. Okay. And it involves using these foreign keys, matching them to the primary keys. So you'll see that in some of the examples coming up. I'm going to stop the video, and when I come back, we will, in the next video, we'll actually look and we'll run some queries that gets data, that pull data from more than one table.